Hello and welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm continuing today to talk about ancient non-biblical literature, ancient Greco-Roman literature, and bad methodology in interpreting that literature. Why am I doing this? Since my ultimate interest is in the Gospels and Acts and biblical reliability. Well, as I explained before, the reason is that these bad methods being applied to non-biblical literature yield conclusions which are then treated as fixed points, as things that we just know, that we've found these non-biblical authors using these compositional devices of changing how things happened, when things happened, and so forth. And then that's used to argue that this was just an accepted part of a particular genre, and the Gospels are in that genre, and so the Gospel authors would have felt free to do the same. Now, there are lots of points at which that reasoning breaks down. But in this series, I'm talking about a point right at the beginning in the question of whether we actually find non-biblical authors making these deliberate changes for literary reasons. And I'm talking about the really poor arguments that are being made there and the way that someone like Dr. Licona or Christopher Pelling, today I'm going to talk about a classicist named John Ramsey, from whom Dr. Licona got some additional claims to this effect, the way that they jump over very normal possibilities like harmonization and also good faith error. And I talked about harmonization a couple of weeks ago, and there was really no reason to think that Plutarch just made up the idea that some Roman senator said something when actually he knew that it was a different Roman senator. There was no reason for him to do that. And in a political body, these guys were all just agreeing with one another. They were supporting the same motions against Julius Caesar. So it would be very natural for them to say that they supported these motions against him and insult him in similar ways, even within the same meeting. Happens in political bodies all the time. Then I talked about a good faith error that Plutarch could readily have made, where he might have misunderstood something that he heard or that he read, and he might have thought that the politician Pompey came in personally into court to give an illegal encomium on a friend who was being tried. And then it could easily have happened that Plutarch just came to understand better what happened. Maybe he reread a source or read a better source or got something cleared up, which could have happened very quickly, and realized, oh, he didn't come in person. He wrote that and gave it to someone else to deliver. It was still illegal, by the way. And how natural that kind of error is. And why should we skip over these possibilities and turn these into, heavy, deliberate changes? There is no good reason. So today I'm going to talk about another case of this kind, again, to just drive home. We don't just uncontroversially find these ancient Romans making these changes according to compositional devices. And I also talked about how even if they do deliberately make changes, it doesn't follow it's a compositional device. I'll be doing more on that subject in the next couple of weeks. Today, I want to talk about the Catiline conspiracy in the 60s BC and some differences between the Roman orator and politician Cicero and the Roman historian and politician Sallust concerning the Catiline conspiracy. Now, in The Mirror or the Mask, which I really encourage you to read if you're interested in these topics, I talk about more than one alleged deliberate change that Sallust made concerning the Catiline conspiracy. I'm just going to hit one such deliberate change today. And this concerns some meetings that Catiline had with the Roman Senate in 63 BC. And I need to give a little background here. I hope you're interested in Roman history, or if you're not, I hope you're interested enough in the Gospels to put up with a little bit of Roman history. So Catiline was another Roman politician who made a conspiracy to overthrow the government of Rome. And it was put down. It was unsuccessful. And Cicero was one of his main opponents in the Roman Senate and gave speech against him and made references to what a bad guy he was. Cicero and Sallust were contemporaries, and they didn't get along all that well either, but they both agreed in that they didn't like Catiline. Now, Cicero gave a speech defending a client. So Cicero was an orator. Orators were often also lawyers, and he was defending a client named Murena. I'm not going to go into why he was defending Murena and how that relates to all of this. I do more of that in The Mirror of the Mask. But in that speech, he talks about 2 times that Catiline met with the Roman Senate in the summer of 63. This would be around July. And I want to read what he says about those 2 meetings, and then I'll go on to tell you more about where the supposed contradiction comes in between Cicero and Sallust, and the claim that Sallust changed something. The claim is that Sallust moved a saying of Catiline to a later meeting with the Senate. All right, so here's Cicero on the 2 earlier meetings. So there's going to be 3 total meetings, all in 63. Cicero, speaking of Catiline, and he, for he was not much addicted to disguising his intentions, did not attempt to clear himself, but openly avowed and adopted the statements. For he said then that there were 2 bodies of the Republic, the one weak with a weak head, the other powerful without a head, and that, as this last had deserved well of him, it should never want a head as long as he lived. The whole Senate groaned at hearing itself addressed in such language, and passed a resolution not severe enough for such unworthy conduct, for some of them were against too rigorous a resolution because they had no fear, and some because they had a great deal. Then he, Catiline, rushed forth from the Senate triumphing and exulting, a man who never ought to have been allowed to leave it alive, especially as that very same man in the same place had made answer to Cato, that gallant man who was threatening him with a prosecution a few days before, that if any fire were kindled against his own fortunes, he would put it out, not with water, but by the general ruin. All right, so in this quotation from Cicero's speech supporting Murena, he talks about 2 different times that Catiline met with the Senate, and in both of these they were basically saying, are you by any chance conspiring to overthrow the Roman government? We think maybe you're conspiring to overthrow the Roman government. This is not a good idea. You shouldn't do this. We should actually prosecute you for conspiring to overthrow the Roman government. And Catiline is pretty insouciant. He doesn't seem to be apologetic or repentant or anything. And what Cicero says is that on the earlier occasion, and these 2 meetings were only a few days apart, Cicero says, he made this threat, basically a threat of bringing things down, destroying Rome, a violent revolution. If any fire were kindled against his own fortunes, he would put it out not with water, but by the general ruin. All right. Now, when Sallust writes about the Catiline conspiracy, he writes about a later meeting between Catiline and the Roman Senate in that same year, because Sallust mentions a different speech that Cicero gave against Catiline. We're actually able to date this meeting to November. So it's yet a 3rd meeting. It's interesting to notice how similar these are. Apparently, classicists don't doubt that all 3 happened, even though they have these similarities. I think that's good. That's right. I wish similar reasoning were applied to things like Jesus cleansing the temple twice, but that's an aside. All right, so here's what Sallust writes about the November meeting in 63. When he would have added other insults, he was shouted down by the whole body, who called him traitor and assassin, Then in a transport of fury he cried, "Since I am brought to bay by my enemies and driven desperate, I will put out my fire by general devastation." Now at that point, Sallust stormed out and he went and engaged in open revolt, open rebellion. Previously, he had been conspiring more or less behind closed doors, though he wasn't apologetic when challenged about it. But after that November meeting, he went out and it was more like an open armed rebellion. So you can see the similarity in the saying, right? If any fire were kindled against his own fortunes, he would put it out not with water, but by the general ruin. That's Cicero's wording. And then, "Since I am brought to bay by my enemies and driven desperate, I will put out my fire by general devastation." All right, that is Sallust's wording. Now, the claim then is that Sallust has moved this saying. In Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, Dr. Licona approvingly quotes a classicist named John Ramsay. Please do not confuse John Ramsay with an archaeologist named William Ramsay that is from much longer ago, who is sometimes quoted as saying something very positive about the historical reliability of Acts. Those are different people. John Ramsay is a contemporary. All right, so here's Ramsay quoted by Licona. "Sallust can't resist post-dating Catiline's threat from July to make it fall precisely on November 8th, so that it will have the greatest impact by having Catiline utter his chilling threat as his last parting words. Sallust, as a creative writer, saw the possibility of making a good story better by tweaking it." Okay. Excuse me, I had to get a drink. All right, so that's Ramsay saying that Sallust moved the threat because it's more exciting if you put it at the end of that third meeting before, he rushes out and engages in open rebellion. Now, the first thing I want to point out here is that it's not really all that implausible that Catiline said this twice. Now, Dr. Licona argues that he didn't. He has an argument concerning Cicero's speech. I'm going to leave you to go read The Mirror of the Mask on that. He just misunderstands the purpose of Cicero's speech supporting Murena and makes an argument from silence there. But he also says, well, it would have been effective one time, but the second time it would have seemed kind of, like he's repeating himself too much. But the fact of the matter is, people who are fond of their own phrases often repeat them. I repeat phrases. I do this. I have a tagline for this channel, Making Common Sense Rigorous. Dr. Licona repeats his phrases, things that he wants to say against those he disagrees with. They're rigid. They engage in black and white thinking, and so on and so on. A lot of us do. Politicians repeat their phrases. Donald Trump repeats his phrases. Okay, people like to repeat their favorite phrases, sometimes even to a similar audience or the same audience. And in fact, the very considerations that Ramsay's bringing up that he says favor Sallust moving it to this last dramatic moment could also have occurred to Catiline as making it a good time to say it again. Okay, he knows at this point that he's going to go and engage in open rebellion, that, the secret's out, the time for any attempt to plead innocence is past. So he's like, I'm going to say that thing again, I'm going to bring it down with put out my fire by the general devastation. So I don't think that's implausible at all. That he was just, fond of the sound of his own voice, fond of that phrase, thought it was a cool phrase, and thought this was a great opportunity to use it. Let's suppose that you think that's ridiculous, that it's such a similar phrase, and because it's so similar, Catiline wouldn't have said it twice to the Senate and to members of the Senate. Now, I think that you're probably, if you think that, you're probably being too strong against that, given the frequency with which people do repeat their own phrases. That would be the harmonizing possibility, which I think we should take seriously. But let's move beyond that. Remember that when I talk about a flow chart, beyond that was it a deliberate change? Okay? Or did Sallust, let's say perhaps, or Cicero, though I think Cicero is speaking closer to the actual events. So if somebody's making an error, more likely Sallust. It looks like Sallust's history of the Catiline conspiracy may have been written some years after the actual events. It's unclear, although Sallust was contemporary with the events, whether he was actually present for these debates. He might have been out of Rome. And so that's kind of up in the air as far as what scholars think on that. Okay, so could Sallust have just made a good faith error as far as when Catiline said that about if his own fortunes were being attacked, he would defend himself by the general devastation, okay, or general ruin. Pretty strong statement. Why not? Why couldn't Sallust have just made a mistake? All right, I want to read something from The Mirror of the Mask, because instead of reinventing what I said there, I think I said it pretty well there. This point deserves stress, I said. Literary device theorists and biblical scholars generally have an extremely bad habit of assuming that if A is a source for B, then B must have had A's manuscript open in front of him at the very moment of writing, must have understood A's manuscript perfectly, and must have had quite clearly in mind every detail pertaining to the point in question. On the basis of these strong assumptions about the process of composition, scholars will immediately conclude that any discrepancy, and perhaps even any difference between B's account and A's, must be the result of a conscious decision on the part of B to depart from what A says. This is far too strong a set of assumptions to be sustained. Consider how complicated the events were in this case. By Cicero's own account, there were at least 2 meetings with Catiline in the summer of the election. One involved a smaller group of senators, and one was with the full Senate. Then there was yet a 3rd meeting in November, at which the Senate again challenged Catiline with accusations of conspiracy against Rome. He was defiant in all 3 cases and left the Senate in anger in all 3 cases without any resolution of the charges against him. Ramsay and Lucona do not deny this. Bearing in mind that there were 3 similar meetings, one can see quite a plausible way in which Sallust might have made a mistake. Suppose that Sallust knew independently of the November meeting with the Senate, perhaps by having read Cicero's oration against Catiline given on that occasion. That, by the way, is not the Cicero speech that I read from earlier. The Cicero speech I read from earlier is his defense of Murena. If Sallust also read Cicero's speech in defense of Murena hastily and or did not remember it clearly, if he then wrote about a meeting of Catiline with the Senate, he might readily become confused about which meeting Cicero is referring to when he describes Murena's threat. Okay. So, I'm pointing out this stuff is complicated. Okay? If Sallust just didn't happen to go and read those exact words in Cicero's speech defending Murena right before writing this down, he could have thought that before Catiline left, he said this thing in November, rather than in the first of the meetings back in the summer. I mean, that could just be a very innocent error. Now, to defend this yet further, even beyond just common sense, there's a rather remarkable point that just sort of dropped into my hands while I was doing my research for The Mirror of the Mask. And this is what I said. in support of this point, I note something rather remarkable. Licona himself makes a mistake about which meeting of the Senate Cicero is talking about when he describes Catiline's threat to bring down Rome with general devastation. Okay, now it's not a big deal that Dr. Licona made a small error, but it is nonetheless an illustration of how easy it is to make small errors. Okay, here I'm going to quote Licona from Why Are the Differences? At a meeting of the Senate that took place about mid-July, on the day when the consular elections were originally to have been held, Catiline uttered an ominous and memorable threat, unquote. Okay, so on the day when the consular elections were originally to have been held. That's actually the second of the two meetings that Cicero mentions in his defense of Murena. And here is what Cicero says. That very same man in the same place had made answer to Cato, that gallant man who was threatening him with a prosecution a few days before, that if any fire were kindled against his own fortunes, he would put it out not with water, but with the general ruin. All right. So, in other words, Cicero's saying it wasn't the second time. It wasn't the second meeting with senators. And the second one is the one that's on the day when the elections were to take place. It was a few days before. That very same man in the very same place, okay? And Licona just slips, okay? Small slip. Here's what I say about this. In our own time, one could have Cicero's oration in defense of Murena open in a computer tab, translated into English at the very moment that one is writing about these historical events on the same computer. Licona was attempting to discuss precisely when Cicero dated Catiline's threat. Yet even with all the advantages of 21st century technology, he made a small slip about what Cicero was saying. My point is simply that this is an excellent illustration of the complexity of the events involved and of how easy it is to make a mistake. How much easier would it be to make a mistake in a time when one had to work with scrolls, notes taken from scrolls, or one's memory? Now this is a really important point. If a modern researcher who can have all of this laid out in multiple tabs all at once and be typing right there can make a small slip about what Cicero is saying, so could Sallust. So if Licona confused the first and the second meetings between Catiline and the Roman Senate in July, in the summer of 63, Sallust could have confused the first and the third taking place in November, as far as on which of these occasions did Catiline utter that threat about general ruin or general devastation. But Licona doesn't even consider that possibility, doesn't even bring it up. This is why we need to approach these things in a less literary way first. Our default shouldn't be that the authors are doing something highly literary. And it illustrates how conjectural all of this is. So you make these conjectures, and then you're like, well, we have seen, it's just like now it's just a given that we've seen the Greco-Roman writers making these changes deliberately and that they use these compositions. We have observed. Okay, well, you haven't. You've conjectured, and you're probably wrong. Because there are far more reasonable possibilities. In this case, either that Catiline said it twice or that Sallust made an ordinary error. Next time I'm going to talk about deception and how just because somebody does change something deliberate, like even if we get beyond that point, we're like, yeah, it looks like he made this change deliberately, it doesn't follow that it's a compositional device that, hey, everybody knew this could happen and all the audiences understood that was part and parcel of the genre, so they took things with kind of a grain of salt, they didn't worry about it, as opposed to being a deception. And that point gets skipped a lot, and in fact, it may be the hardest node of the flowchart to get past. So I'll be giving some examples of that next time. Please come back to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.